Chapter 11 The Morgan Mare. Skip pulled engine to a halt, turned in his saddle, and waved frantically to the lagging riders. He cupped gloved hands to his mouth and called, "Hurry up! Hurry! I saw him off over there. I was just ready with my six-shooter when he slunk out of sight." At once, Frank and George urged their Indian cayuses onward until they had galloped up to the side of Skip. There they put the three ponies, turned tails against the sweeping wind, and huddled together for a brief rest. "Where'd you say that pesky coyote went?" demanded Frank. "I thought for sure we had him cornered back there a ways." I don't know where he is, and I don't care," shivered George, as he anxiously eyed the sullen sky. He beat his stiffened hands together. "It's getting colder and colder. I'd say we're in for blizzard weather. We'd better locate Bill with that chuck wagon full of supplies. I'm starved." "Guess you're right, George," Skip agreed. "It sure is getting colder every minute, and if we're going to round up those wild horses that broke out of the corral, we'd better get moving. Since Miller's giving me half of the increase from all the wild horses we round up here in Harney Valley, I don't feel I can afford to lose any. Now, if it'd been those inbred critters with humpbacks and crooked legs, I wouldn't care about 'em running away. But I've got to go after the good ones. I'll try to find Jim. Maybe he and Bill got 'em corralled by this time. I sure hope so, for I don't like the looks of that gray sky or the feel of the teeth in that wind. Temperature's dropping fast, too. Soon's we'll find the chuck wagon and get something hot to eat. You two better head for home and take care of our stock. I'll be along soon as this job's finished." Skip's tanned forehead crinkled in a worried frown as he and Frank and George urged their ponies onward over the weary miles, each one too cold and hungry for further speech. And not a word was spoken until Frank startled them with his wild yell. "Hip hurrah!" he shouted, first to spot Bill's crackling campfire, a cheerful red glowing spot of warm color in the monotonous gray of sky and sagebrush plain. "Nothing looks so good or smells so good as a big sagebrush fire," he stated. Dismounting stiffly, he threw on several big gray-green branches and gratefully turned his half-frozen hands back and forth before the leaping blaze. "Say there, Frank, don't pile on any more fuel now. You'll spoil my frying pan bread if you do. I've got the coals just about right for cooking. Here goes." Mouths watering, the three hungry riders watched Bill put the stiff dough of salted flour, baking powder, tallow, and water into the greased frying pan. Fred hurried to help as Bill said, "Here, Frank, hold this over the coals until it bakes on the bottom, will you? And tip her over up sideways until the top's good and brown. Guess I don't need to tell an old cowhand like yourself how to do it, though. Well, boys, smells like the coffee pot's starting to boil, and soon's I'll fry some beef steak. We'll set and eat. Thought Jim would be along for now. But we won't wait. I wish he'd come rolling in, though. Weather's sure fixing to blow. It looks right bad. How good the sizzling hot food tasted. The four hungry young chaps ate every scrap of the smoke and sand seasoned meal and pronounced it delicious. Skip and Frank and George found it a real effort to tear themselves away from the fire's bone penetrating warmth and head into the rushing, biting cold wind. You boys ride for home and don't stop for anything till you get there, Skip ordered, turning engine towards the distant corral in the opposite direction. I'll find Jim and we'll come as soon as we can. Horses or no horses, I'm not aiming to stay out in blizzard weather. It just ain't good sense to do so, as Pa always used to say. It seemed to Skip as though he had ridden for hours before he finally reined his horse in at Crow Camp. There he found the broken down horse corral newly repaired and all the escaped horses safely imprisoned. Good old Jim, he thought gratefully. He's right on the job. He's been here and gone long since. I'd better get while the getting's good, since there's nothing left for me to do. I sure don't like the feeling of this weather. Again, he looked anxiously from the low leaden sky down to Injun's drooping head. What's the matter, old boy? He questioned. What's the matter? Plumb tired and beat out. Sure you are. I keep forgetting you're not as young as you used to be. Some of these days, I suppose I'll have to get me another riding horse and turn you out to where you can live in clover. But I sure hate to do it. You and me have been pals ever since Pa brought you home. Come on, Injun. We've got to get going, old boy. Keep a sure footing and watch sharp for gopher holes. They'd never do for you to break a leg. And it'd never do for me to be stranded out here afoot. I'd freeze in no time. As though he understood his master's commands, Injun loped steadily onward, mile after mile, till they neared Little Crow Camp. By this time Skip rode half blindly, his long eyelashes beaded with tiny ice crystals. With perfect trust, he relied upon faithful Injun to carry him to safety, for not once in the long years since Pa had bought the white yearling home from the Silver Creek battlefield had the pony failed him. Why, it seems only last year that Pa brought Skip's tired head dropped toward his chest. Wham! There was a thud and a shrill scream from Injun. Skip catapulted through the air and crashed savagely into a clump of sagebrush. There he lay stunned until Injun's sharp groans and the sound of his thrashing legs jerked Skip dizzily to his feet. Injun! What's wrong? What's wrong, old boy? Skip's heart sank as he scrambled painfully toward the groaning pony, afraid to look, afraid not to look. What's wrong, old boy? He called again, and heard the pony's frantic whinny. Hold steady, I'm coming. I'm coming. You'll be all right. Steadily he talked on and on, but when he reached Injun, his throat was too full for speech. He could only kneel, white-lipped and helpless, beside his four-footed friend. He could only look at his pony's shattered leg and watch his agonizing struggle to rise. It's no use, boy, Skip whispered through dry, cracked lips. It's no use at all. You'll never walk again. That badger hole did it. Almost filled up with dirt that away. You couldn't see it, could you, boy? No engine, you couldn't see it. I should have stayed awake and not left it all to you. You were plumb tired out, too. Poor old engine. Skip felt his heart would break as Injun's pain-glazed eyes stared piteously up into his. He saw the almost human look in their brown depths, as though the pony understood his master's words and accepted his heartbroken apology. But Skip knew that the hardest part of this ordeal lay ahead. Slowly he pulled his six-shooter out of its holster, biting his lip until the blood came. His eyes misted until it was with difficulty that he saw Injun at all. There was only a pain-filled blur of quivering horseflesh in front of him. There were only himself and Injun in the great expanse of lonely, cold-filled prairie. And in a moment, there would be only himself. I, I got to do it, boy, he whispered. For your sake, I've got to do it. I can't let you suffer. It'll be over in just a second, old boy. Goodbye, Injun. Goodbye. There was one sharp report that rolled and echoed across the bleak prairie. There was one great sudden start, as though even in death, Injun, at his master's bidding, would leap into flight. Then all nature seemed to hush, until the gun's last echoes faded away into the outer pool of cold silence. Only one sound broke the deathly stillness, the heartbroken sobs of the boy who had lost Pa's gift, the hot, unashamed tears of the young man who had lost the friend who had proved faithful even unto death. Skip never knew how long he sat beside the quiet engine. He only knew that he aroused to cold and heartache in a frightened awareness of the quick gathering lonely dusk. He never knew how he half walked, half staggered with his saddle into the deserted, windowless cabin at Little Crow Camp. But he blessed the unknown person who had built it and the unknown camper who had left firewood and matches beside the rusted stove. Huddled by its warmth, he fitfully dozed throughout the long night, oblivious of the howling wind and the savage snow blasts that rattled against the tiny shelter. He roused only to the early morning shouts of the searching party led by Frank and George, suddenly conscious of the gray dawn in the cooling heater. Say, are we glad to find you? Frank exclaimed over and over, joyfully thumping him on the back. Are we glad? Why, we almost passed right by this place. There wasn't any horse in sight, and we knew you and Injun be together. If George hadn't sighted the wisp of smoke coming out of the rusty stovepipe, we'd never have stopped. It was sure a good thing you'd built a fire. But what happened? Surely Injun didn't run off and leave you. That good old pony never do that. Skip's answer was brief, but he didn't trust his voice, for it threatened to quaver and stop, and he couldn't break down in front of the men clustered around him. They wouldn't understand. To them, Injun was nothing more than a right smart cow pony. But to him, well, to him, Injun was the last actual boyhood link with Pa. Skip remembered that even after Pa went away, he still had seemed sort of close at hand whenever Skip rode Injun through the tall rye grass or sat motionless on his back, watching the flocks of wild ducks, geese, or cranes, which sometimes hid the sun in their flight. He remembered how Pa had loved the lush prairie grass, the birds, the great thundering herds of antelope. No, the men wouldn't rightly understand. Only Ma would understand. But somehow he couldn't talk about his loss even to her. For weeks the ranchers discussed Skip's narrow escape from death. He too often thought of that long afternoon and longer night, and shuddering wondered how and why he had been spared. He reflected that the very circumstance of Injun's fall had been a factor in his escape. For the accident had occurred at any greater distance from Little Crow Camp, he too would have lost his life. That very night, the weather had turned so cold that a man actually had froze to death several miles south of Harney. Over and over, Skip heard the story, told and retold. Two or three gathered for a brief visit. Yes, sir, he was so cold he somehow got down off that load of hay he was a haulin' for winter feeding. In he goes to this old deserted cabin and tries to build a fire. But he couldn't. No, sir, his fingers was just too stiffened up with cold. He couldn't even light a match. And there he was when they found him. Why, Frank and George Whitting had froze their fingers and toes before they got home from that trip. And they was a riding ahead of the storm, too. We thought 'em out right smart, though, so they was all right. But no one could have thawed out that poor feller. He was done for. Skip thought the long winter would never end, but at last it did, as do all long winters, with soft blue skies, gentle winds, and full rushing streams. It was on a warm day that he took a trip to Harney. It had all come about unexpectedly. I'd like to I'd like to go over there, Ma told him one morning. Ella wants to visit a school friend, and I thought we could drive over and spend the day. We'll make an outing out of it. You've been low-spirited ever since last fall, and it'd do you good to have a little pleasure outing. Go on and harness up while I finish packing a good lunch, so we can have a picnic somewhere along the way, if we've a mind to. It won't take me long to get ready. Afterwards, Skip could see the well-planned design in the whole day. The invitation to make the trip, the arrival in Harney, the mention to the butcher that the butcher wanted to see him, and the surprise that awaited him. However, as he drove down the street and walked into the butcher shop, he had no inkling of his mother's plan. He could only stare inquiringly at the jovial owner's message. Well, you're here at last, young feller. Thought I'd have to make the trip over to your place to get rid of all this purchase your ma made. But she's sure a beauty if ever there was one. It took a long time for me to make up my mind to let go of her, but your ma finally persuaded me to do so. She's right out back of the shop waiting for you. Come on through this way, y'all. It'll save walking around. But, I don't know what you're talking about, Skip stammered. He turned red and hung back as they neared the doorway. Who's a beauty? And who's waiting for me? I'm not expecting to meet anybody here. You sure must have made a mistake. Ha ha ha, laughed the friendly butcher. He slapped a big hand on his aproned leg and doubled over with mirth. I guess you've got a real surprise coming, all right. 'Cause I sure ain't made no mistake. Ha 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 ha. The grace of the sleek, proud mare looking straight at him made Skip's breath catch in his throat. Ears pricked forward, head erect, she stood poised for flight, anxiously awaiting a rider. She's yours, son. Ma, Ma's quiet voice spoke in Skip's ear. From the very first time your pa saw Sarah Winnemucca riding her over at old Fort Hardy, he said, that's the horse for Skip to get. I've always said there's nothing to equal a Morgan mare for speed and endurance, and best of all, faithfulness. She'd be the start of a mighty fine strain of horseflesh. Maybe someday our boy can have a horse like that. Then your pa did get you a horse. He brought home your pony. All these years you loved Injun, and he loved you too. I knew that when he went, you'd felt like the last I with Pa had been cut in two. Skip's lips trembled as he looked into Ma's kind face. He'd known that Ma had surely understood how he had felt, why she put his feelings into words better than he could do himself. He put his arm around Ma as she finished speaking. When at last there came a chance to buy the very horse your pa saw the princess riding on, it just seemed to me almost as if pa's dearest wish had come true. So here's your horse, my boy. Here's the present your pa and ma wanted you to have. Here's your Morgan Mayer.